Welcome to the Citizens Band Radio Hour. Thoughtful conversations that explore issues of media and journalism, democracy and citizenship. The Citizens Band Radio Hour is sponsored by the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. You can visit the center online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Here's your host, Coy Barefoot.
Michael Schudson is an award-winning, best-selling author, historian, and sociologist. He teaches in the Graduate School of Journalism and the Department of Sociology at Columbia University in New York. Michael's many books include the classic Discovering the News, A Social History of American Newspapers, and The Good Citizen, A History of American Civic Life. Michael's most recent book is The Rise of the Right to Know, Politics and the Culture of Transparency, 1945 to 1975. This conversation with Michael Schudson was originally recorded in the fall of 2015 on the release of his new book.
Michael, it's so much fun for me to welcome you back to the program. I have very much been looking forward to talking.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
Let's put the book in context first. It's in many ways a real follow-up to your last book, The Good Citizen, A History of American Civic Life. This is a follow-up that looks very, very closely at sort of that period after the World War II, the last half of the 20th century, at a particular cultural development when Americans identified openness and transparency in government as something of a virtue, as a way that we would come to understand what it meant to live in a free country, in a democratic republic. And openness became a value of what it meant to be a citizen. Help us understand the thesis of your book and the key takeaways.
First of all, although we owe a tremendous amount to your local political star, Thomas Jefferson, and you can find easily online the claim that Thomas Jefferson was the author of the line, "Information is the currency of democracy." Turns out he never said that, never wrote that, and that particular line was penned by Ralph Nader some 2 centuries later. And there is, I think, a great lesson in this, that we kind of backdate our best ideals to the founders, and I give them all kinds of credit, but they did not expect that democracy would operate on what we think of today as openness, transparency, civic information. They basically, this oversimplifies a bit, but basically they expected that the voters would make judgments about the candidates for office based on their personal knowledge of people in their communities, send them off to the state capitol, and let them do their job, and participate, check on them 2 years or 4 years later, whenever the next election was. Some contemporary political theorists refer to that basic election-based democracy as a kind of episodic democracy, and that after 1945, but increasingly in the 60s and 70s and ever since, people came to recognize that our world is quite different now from anything the founders contemplated. They saw legislatures as the real heart of what government should be, and not the executive. Now, that has changed, and I think it has inevitably changed, but those contemporary political theorists at their most optimistic, they're not all optimistic, but at their most optimistic, they see a new kind of democracy having emerged over the last half century. Some of them call it a counter-democracy. Some of them call it a monitory democracy. There's no consensus about this. But that we've moved from that episodic democracy to a durable democracy of distrust, in a way, that power corrupts. Power is dangerous. That part we can share with the founders, who believe that very much. But all power is also inevitable. And how does a general public keep its own sovereignty in light of a huge and expansive government bureaucracies, especially the federal bureaucracy? One thing you do, and one thing that has been done, is to find institutional mechanisms and also find an ethic, a public ethic that says, you need to share information with us. We need to have ways of keeping track of what's going on in the government. And that was the number and variety of such institutions in the U.S. really began to multiply beginning after 1945. There were a few things before, but particularly after 1945, and growing enormously in the 60s and 70s with Freedom of Information Act and consumer information policies and less secrecy in the Congress, and so on and so forth. There's not to mention in the broader public that in every corner of life, people began to value a kind of new directness, just to move away from government for a moment. The most dramatic instance of this that I've come upon are two surveys of doctors treating patients with cancer. 1961 survey and 1979 repeat survey. In 1961, about 12% of doctors said that they ordinarily would tell their patients with cancer that they have cancer. 12%. 1979, it was 98%. It was just a wild transformation from a point where the doctor was Mr. Paternalistic and kept uncomfortable information to himself. 1979, that whole era of medicine had largely passed.
That is absolutely fascinating that this change happens in just 20 years. And you write in the book, Michael, that when you started out, you were operating under the thinking that this was sort of a 60s thing, that we could look at the movements and the cultural revolution that took place in the 1960s in America and elsewhere as sort of the nexus and the larger explanation for where this cultural shift came from, where we saw the real push for transparency and openness, not only in government, but interpersonally, as you write, in journalism, in the media. But you were surprised to find that actually it goes deeper than the 60s.
Yes, and you're right. I was surprised by that. There was so much of the kind of sloganeering in the 60s. Let it all hang out, for instance. That's 60s talk. That's let's take to the streets talk. But while the 60s are important in this story, the people who sort of set up the possibility for the 60s were a generation older. So the key person in passing the Freedom of Information Act, which passes 1966, began his efforts toward it in 1955. This was Representative John Moss from California, and he had already, in 1953, he began in the Congress. He'd been in the state legislature. He was born in 1913. And the key people involved in the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act, 1970, which was a vitally important environmental law, and one connected with transparency because it created the environmental impact statement, which for the first time involved people and environmental groups and others in knowing what the government agencies had determined might be the environmental impacts of a proposed dam or highway or so on.
Sure.
The public had never been involved in any of those deliberations, and now those statements had to be made public before any action was taken. And who was behind that? Well, again, people born in around the era of World War I, who came of age in or immediately after World War II. People like Senator Scoop Jackson was the chief sponsor of that bill. I mean, these were people who were already seasoned veterans in politics by the time of the Vietnam War and anti-war protests and so on. They and even take that. I mean, the person, so far as we can tell, who actually said the environmental impact statement should be a public statement. That was Senator Gaylord Nelson from Wisconsin in a conversation with Scoop Jackson and Senator Muskie. And he's best known today, I think, as the inventor of Earth Day, 1970, later that year in 1970. But his political experience and his education and his background, he was not out in the streets in the 1960s. He was in the State House in Wisconsin. So I think of this era from roughly the congressional elections of 1958 up until the Kennedy assassination in '63 as called the pre-'60s. But it's an important transformative era that has kind of got swallowed up in historiography by understandable interest in the mass protests and demonstrations of the '60s.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. This other thing too.
It's fascinating how they just laid the groundwork and plant the seeds. You see the same thing in literature, I guess, as well. I'm sitting here thinking of, the Beats are in the late 40s and the 50s, and they sort of they lead to the beatniks, which lead to the hippies, and but they were there in the late 40s, in the post-war period, and in the 50s, planting the seed and laying the groundwork for what would become a major cultural shift. It really is a fascinating period here where we can see, for the first time, a new kind of value of what it means to live free, how we define ourselves as an American people and come to place a premium on something like openness and transparency. Because as you write in your book, that was not always the case. Absolutely not the case, where what it meant to be an American meant to live with a transparent government. People just didn't really think of that as an important thing in society.
No, and people in the government, you took a certain amount of confidentiality absolutely for granted that got completely shaken up. I mean, John Moss's concern was not with government secrecy overall. That is, it's quite interesting. Another thing that many people don't realize, that the Freedom of Information Act, which allows any citizens, any person, actually you don't even have to be a citizen, to request information from executive agencies of the government, from the FBI or from the Social Security Administration or whatever. You can send a request and sometimes get it answered, not always promptly, but the government is obliged by the letter of the law to respond. But the point I want to make was that it doesn't cover the Congress. John Moss was representing the Congress trying to control the executive branch of government. His worry and the worry of his colleagues, among them, when the law was passed, Donald Rumsfeld, who supported the Freedom of Information Act enthusiastically, this was an effort not to create necessarily a broad sense of public transparency, but a very specific sense that the executive branch of government had gotten out of hand. So that's one thing going on there. But within a few years thereafter, the Congress itself becomes much more open, and it was stunning to me to learn that the extent to which secrecy had prevailed in congressional activities up until that point. So from the early 19th century up until the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970, a lot of congressional votes took place in quasi-secrecy. When the Congress assembled to discuss and debate amendments to legislation, they convened as what they still call, the Committee of the Whole. And voting in the Committee of the Whole, the votes were counted, certainly, and the total count was public information. But which representative voted for and which representative voted against on amendments before the Committee of the Whole was not public, and a group called the Democratic Study Group set up after the 1958 congressional elections and bringing more liberal Democrats into the Congress. That group was pushing for legislative reform, hoping to open up the Congress. And one thing they wanted to do was to make those votes in the Committee of the Whole more open. And the leader of the Democratic Study Group was talking with a journalist friend. He himself was an ex-journalist. And he said, how come you guys in the media aren't covering this very important effort? And his journalist friend said, this is inside Washington stuff. This is not news out there.
That's great.
But they kept talking, and the journalist friend said, why don't you call what you're trying to do anti-secrecy amendments? And the insider, Dick Conlon, said, anti-secrecy amendments. What a good idea. So that's exactly what they did, and it was, every newspaper in the country picked it up, and it was something of a sensation and a big transition in the Congress.
It's not just the practice of open government and transparency is relatively new in the American story. The very idea, the very cultural value we put on that idea is also really new. It's just a few decades old. That's my claim. And, you can find some, as I say, some exceptions to it. There are, I don't know that any of that could have happened without the 18th century Enlightenment. There was also efforts, particularly with regard to economic information and required corporation reports to the security, the SEC. That's in the New Deal legislation, but the broad sweep from across pretty much every aspect of public policy, that's post-World War II.
You're listening to my conversation with best-selling and award-winning author Michael Schudson. I'm Coy Barefoot. We'll be back after a short break. Michael will join us in the second half of this program.
Michael, we're talking about a cultural change. I mean, this is real anthropology, sociology here. This is a cultural movement that found populist expression in the movements of the 60s. The seeds have been planted in the previous couple of decades. But we're talking about a really seismic shift in the way Americans think about their government, about themselves, their relationship to one another, their relationship to power, which is a real change in values. And we were talking earlier in the program that of course, is the Enlightenment, the Western Enlightenment, which found expression in the revolutions of the 18th century. Those were revolutions of values. The founders asked people to think differently, to make different value judgments about their relationship to their government, the power of their government, what is good government, and what does that mean. And so we see that period again here in the 60s, and we are living with that today, with what happened then.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And you correctly see the issue at the heart of this book as a sociological or anthropological one. I'm really interested in how does a culture change. If you go back to Marx, culture is a kind of superstructure. It follows more basic and fundamental changes in economy or technology, and certainly economy and technology really matter. But sometimes there's something we'd have to think of as social, cultural, intellectual, that's happening at a different level and is pervasive or becomes pervasive, and yet it's hard to say, oh, well, it all began at this moment or with this act. It kind of moves across the sky and subtly and cloud-like, and suddenly the world looks different.
Right,
the world
right.
feels different.
I'm left wondering too, when we talk about the seeds of this really cultural part of the cultural revolutions of the 60s being transparency in government and openness, and we want to talk about how that found expression in some government policy and also in journalism as well. But I'm wondering, when we can see the seeds coming out of the post-war generation, do you think it might have had anything to do with what happened in the world in the 40s when the West saw firsthand the really horrific and tragic results of the Nazis and the fascists in Italy, and these were incredibly opaque power structures that were anything but transparent to their citizenry. Do you think that had anything to do with it, that there was sort of a progressive movement in the opposite direction, like we don't want to be like that?
Yes, I do think that's so. I think World War II sort of set that up and the reaction to it, but then it comes to full expression not with respect to fascism, but with respect to the Soviet Union. And it's the Cold War is the point at which, so we're talking late 40s and early 50s, the point at which the definition of who we are as Americans, or who we are as what then began to be called the free world, was made in clear and dramatic, when possible, contradistinction to what would later be called the evil empire of the Soviet Union. But they were the closed society. They were the totalitarian society. They were a society of slavery. We were the society of freedom, and that's in what I was looking at. That's most clearly the case with the effort of Representative Moss and others to extract more information from the executive branch of government. Moss got interested in the whole topic because he was in his first term as a congressman in the early 50s. He's on the Post Office and Civil Service Commission, and he's interested in getting some employment information out of the post office, particularly what's the record of their efforts to dismiss postal employees suspected of disloyalty. In other words, sympathetic to the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And the Post Office and Civil Service Commission get back to Moss and say, no, just no. We don't have to share that information with you.
That's great.
He was a small businessman in Sacramento. He'd spent a few years in the California legislature, but he was not a worldly fellow. This was a relatively provincial guy who believed absolutely in the storybook versions of democracy, and now he was a member of Congress. And
this was Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, wasn't it?
He was absolutely Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Yeah. And he was appalled and outraged, and that outrage from that rejection of the refusal to give him the information he asked fueled an 11-year effort to come up with some legislation that would change that. And along the way, he gave endless numbers of speeches in which he would accuse the U.S. government of acting like the Soviets, acting like the Russians, and creating what he called a paper curtain in Washington, as opposed to the Iron Curtain.
So he took to publicly shaming them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the end result was the Freedom of Information Act.
That's right.
Wow.
That's right, and it was a very powerful rhetoric. And the other thing that does go right back to World War II and intersects with that, I think, was the GI Bill, which made higher education. Here I can't say that I've nailed down all the evidence, but I do think we probably don't, as historians, give quite enough credit to the huge growth in higher education in the 50s and 60s, and changes in higher education, so that studying literature, really beginning in the 50s, for instance, literature and social sciences too, but it became less and less the handing down of the canon and books and works regarded as beyond reproach, and it became more and more an effort to evoke in students some degree of critical thinking and reading against the text and thinking on their own as kind of fledgling researchers and scholars themselves. And I think that sort of spread of a critical culture is part of what made these innovations quickly acceptable. So all of that does sound like a new enlightenment. I think in a way it was. it wasn't all what we would call liberal in its efforts. Some of the new legislation was of interest to people because it didn't cost very much. I mean, it was you weren't building new highways; you were adding a few bureaucrats. The budgetary requirements were quite modest, so it was conservative in that sense. And some of the efforts, I'm thinking of efforts in truth in lending, truth in packaging, all legislation around which came into being in the early 60s and middle 60s, and then voluntary efforts in the supermarket industry followed, with some federal prodding. This phrase was not familiar to me, but one of the reforms was called open dating. Sounds like Friday night at the bar, but it referred to not that, but the dairy case at your local supermarket, where the store has stamped "do not buy," the expiration date.
Yeah.
But up until around 1970, the expiration date was written in code so that the store employee knew what it said, but the consumer did not. The other thing that came in at the same time, so the open dating meant the consumer can read it too. The kind of theory behind that is pure conservative market economics. I mean, information should be free. The free market works when the buyer has information to compare products. Unit pricing came in at the same time, so that you didn't have to divide this the price by the 14 3/4 ounces size of the box and compare it to the other price in the 7-ounce box. I mean, people would have had to take calculators with them to the store to shop for the most economical product. You didn't have to do that after the early 70s. The supermarkets changed.
And, of course, all of this is happening at the same time that we are, as you write in The Good Citizen, the same time that the rights citizen, this period when there's these major populist movements in the country, the civil rights movement, the student movement, the anti-war movement, the second wave of feminism, gay rights, the environmental movement, and this new cultural shift in thinking about openness and transparency and access to information and really putting sunlight on power, that becomes, within that context of this period of understanding citizenship and rights, that's where we start to think of this transparency and this access to this information as a right, even though it's not there in the Constitution, arguably the Ninth Amendment, but it's not explicitly citizens have the right to know. But since the 60s, that's how we define one element of freedom and democracy and citizenship is we do have this right to know.
Right, yeah, and which I refer to as a cultural right to know because it's not in the Constitution. There's sort of inklings of it, but nothing that is enforceable in the judicial system. It's and this sense that we do have some kind of a right. We're supposed to be the people that are supposed to be sovereigns in this democracy. That notion was sort of revived and, in my own opinion, exaggerated, so that, well, for instance, there's a lot of balancing, I think, And the Freedom of Information Act is a good example. The Freedom of Information Act gives people the right to request information from the executive agencies of the government, and the government has an obligation to respond to these requests unless the request falls within one of 9 exemptions in the law. Now, part of what's interesting here is that John Moss and other proponents of the Act were very unhappy about this laundry list of exemptions, and they accepted them finally as a compromise with Lyndon Johnson, who otherwise was threatening to veto the bill. We don't know what might have happened if they didn't compromise as much as they did, but it might not have become law. But some of the compromises, I myself think, were wise. I mean, I think that, including some that are fairly controversial, like the one that protects, that is, does not require certain deliberations in the government to be revealed to the requester. That if there's, so that people within a committee can talk freely, elected or appointed officials can discuss among themselves, can throw up trial balloons, can think out loud in ways that they wouldn't if they knew that this might be in the front page of the Washington Post the next day. So now you don't want that to be too well protected, but you don't want to do without it. It seems to me, and democracy is this complicated mix of trust. You elect a representative, and there's some level you have to trust that person, and distrust, where you also have to keep an eye on him or her, and have mechanisms to hold that person to account.
Yeah, as Jefferson wrote, and we do know he wrote this, that free government is founded in jealousy, not in confidence. And he encouraged citizens to be jealous of the power, the temporary power with which we entrust our fellow human beings in government, to be jealous of that power and have the courage and the means to question them. Yes,
I think that. But where you draw the line is an endlessly complicated task, and it shifts over time. But I do think that the efforts, on balance, toward greater transparency in government, through the kinds of developments that I talk about in the book. On balance, this was a great advance for democracy.
Michael Schudson is at the Columbia School of Journalism. His new book is The Rise of the Right to Know, Politics and the Culture of Transparency. Michael, let me ask you about what something that crossed my mind when I was reading over the book is that there seems to have been, over the last few decades, a sort of a real pushback to this cultural shift in openness in government, and arguably a countervailing force if we connect some dots with, the Powell memo in 71 and Buckley versus Vallejo in 76 to Citizens United, 9/11, the secret FISA courts, and NSA unconstitutional wiretapping, and the Obama DOJ going after whistleblowers in a really unprecedented way that has made true investigative journalism in Washington almost impossible. There seems to be a real effort, whether it's in the public sector in government or even in the corporate private sector, to resist this idea of openness and transparency. And that resistance has found expression in institutions and in secret policies and off-book funding and black money and money in politics. And it seems like arguably there's now more secrecy than there ever was.
There is pushback. You're right about that. And but there may be more secrecy in that there is so much more government activity, a huge Department of Defense, endless classifying of information that almost everyone seems to agree is overclassified, but and declassification is slow and cumbersome and underfunded. But the sum of all that, although there's just so much more information, there's more secret information than ever before, but it's also true. There's more public information than ever before. I mean, both have grown.
Right.
And
if anything, the value we place on openness and transparency has arguably never been stronger, which makes us see even more when the government or the corporate sector is being opaque.
Yeah. Yes. So, and again, I mean, part of what struck me in the research is just how much was not examined early on. The best case being the media that for a century or more talked about its allegiance to pursuing the 5 W's in its stories: who, what, when, where, why. But if you look at stories before roughly the early 60s, there's no why. It's who, what, when, where.
Right.
And it's it's pretty much quoting public officials. You quote Democrats, you quote Republicans, and you're done. That changed quite dramatically over the course of the 60s, and journalists who lived in Washington in particular through the 50s and the 60s can hardly believe what they accepted as normal in the 50s. It was like Alice in Wonderland. They just fallen through some rabbit hole, and it just looks like a completely different world to them when they look back on it. So I don't, it's investigative reporting is hard. Some of the efforts of the Obama administration don't make it any easier, but it basically didn't exist in the 1940s and 1950s. That's an important thing to remember, that the culture inside newsrooms changed profoundly.
And this rise of the right to know and the new cultural value we put on openness and transparency found expression in journalism as well, and it revolutionized the newsroom and how we craft news, create news, and what we consider good journalism.
Very much. One of the chapters in the book grows out of an article I wrote with Catherine Fink, professor at Pace University, where we did some content analysis of news in several different newspapers in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And what we were interested in was the shift away from the straight straight conventional news story, quote the Democrat, quote the Republican, and go home, into what we call contextual reporting. More interpretive, more analytical, to some degree more open to criticism. But we were quite surprised at how dramatic the change was. In our sample from the mid-50s, more than 90% of front-page stories were what we call conventional reporting. By the 1980s, it's about 50%. I mean, just a huge change. So it's still there. The kind of here's what the mayor said today story, but half the time now, half the time by 2000, and I think it's probably higher than this now. It was here's what the mayor said, and by the way, here's why we suspect he said it. If he wants to get his program through the city council, he's going to have to please X and Y and Z, and a kind of an analysis of not only what's happening, but why politically it's happening, or why culturally it's happening, or that it makes newspapers and other news media more interesting.
And it makes it more valuable to the citizen who would assume that role, as you say, of monitoring power in government and taking that responsibility to keep tabs on that exercise of power.
Yes, I think, I don't think reporters were naive in 1950, and they knew a lot about what was going on in the back rooms in Washington, but they just accepted that was not reportable. Well, no longer.
The book is The Rise of the Right to Know, Politics and the Culture of Transparency, 1945 to 1975. Michael Schudson is at the Columbia School of Journalism. Michael, it is truly always a privilege, sir. I can't thank you enough for being so generous with your time.
Coy, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
You've been listening to the Citizens Band Radio Hour, a production of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Archived podcasts are available online at mediaandcitizenship.org. The executive producers for the program are Siva Vaidyanathan and Coy Barefoot.